Hello. I want to introduce myself tonight. I'm Lisa Presley. I am one of the Congregational Life Consultants for your MidAmerica region, and I'm delighted to be the technical host for this evening's presentation by the Minnesota UU Social Justice Alliance and on Organizing 101. This is one of a series of 6 different webinars that they're going to be doing for us. Before I introduce the people who will be speaking tonight, I want to start with a chalice lighting reading for us all. So either light your chalice where you are or just imagine it in your brain. And this comes from the meditation manual, Voices from the Margins, which features the voices of ministers and others of color in our movement. And so this one is called Labyrinth, and it's by the Reverend Leslie Takahashi. Walk the maze within your heart. Guide your steps into its questioning curves. This labyrinth is a puzzle leading you deeper into your own truths. Listen in the twists and turns. Listen in the openness within all searching. Listen. A wisdom within you calls to a wisdom beyond you, and in that dialogue lies peace. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our guests to you, or our leaders tonight. First, I'd like to introduce the Reverend Ashley Horan, who is the Executive Director of MUUSJA, as they pronounce it, the Minnesota UU Social Justice Alliance. I'd like to introduce Pastor Danny Givens, who is the statewide organizer for MUUSJA. And they have with them tonight Liz Loeb, the Associate Director of Kaleo Center for Faith, Justice, and Social Transformation. And I'm sure she'll let me know if I pronounced that improperly. But right now,
great.
Oh, I did great. Okay, so I'm going to mute myself right now. Please remember you can type questions in the chat, and I'll turn it over to our leaders for this evening.
Hi, everybody. So good to be with you all. And I'm so heartened to see the groups of justice teams working together and being on this webinar together. This is wonderful. So tonight's theme is Organizing 101 for congregational justice leaders. And we'll talk a little bit more in a moment about why our fabulous guest Liz Loeb is with us tonight. But I just wanted to start off sort of by saying that in my position as Executive Director of MUUSJA, I span a couple of worlds, and I work specifically with our congregations, Unitarian Universalist, and sometimes in other traditions. And then I work with secular organizers and movement organizations and doing justice work in our communities. And a thing that I've noticed and that my comrades here have noticed is that often there's kind of a disconnect about language, about theories of how things change and how we create justice in the world between secular and religious organizations that are working for justice. So often we share the same goals and often the same vision, but we don't necessarily know how to communicate about those things. And I think there are lessons that can go both ways. But tonight we're specifically going to be talking about lessons from organizing, sort of big concepts from secular movements for justice that can be useful for us, those of us who are in Unitarian Universalist congregations specifically. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Danny to introduce himself, and then we're going to have Liz tell you a little bit about herself.
I'm Pastor Danny Givens. I'm the statewide organizer with MUUSJA, and it's great to be here this evening. What caused me to this particular topic tonight, we're talking about Organizing 101, is just in my other life, I'm also an activist with Black Lives Matter Minneapolis, and so I've had a great deal of experience with kind of organizing faith communities that haven't had the experience in doing, activist and/or justice work in these ways. And it's important not only to have this language or ways of being, but also this understanding of how to be present and or be in community with impacted communities that we will find ourselves organizing with. And so this particular webinar and workshop will hopefully add some value to those who aspire to grow in that area.
And I think that's my cue to introduce myself. Hi, everyone. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. I am lucky enough to work with Danny and Ashley here in the Twin Cities, and it is an ongoing joy from which I learned so much. My name is Liz Loeb. I use she, her, and hers pronouns, and I'm the Associate Director of the Kaleo Center for Faith, Justice, and Social Transformation. I'll tell you a quick bit about the Kaleo Center. I'll tell you a quick bit about me and a little bit about why this work is so important to me. The Kaleo Center is housed at United Theological Seminary, which is a explicitly LGBT welcoming, multi-tradition, multi-denomination seminary rooted in the UCC tradition here in the Twin Cities. And the Kaleo Center exists as an independent entity to do three things. We teach social transformation as a discipline to faith leaders who are in seminary. We organize within the national field of seminarians and faith leaders around the question of how social transformation as a practice can be taught and can be learned in our work. And then finally, we act in community to build an infrastructure for solidarity, to be at the place where faith and multiple traditions of faith and spiritual practice intersect with movements for justice, and to build some of the foundations and relationships that are needed for those relationships to play out in the world. So I'm thrilled that this is the work I get to do. And my background is I grew up on the East Coast. I've lived in Minnesota for 8 years now, and I'm really lucky to make my adult life here. I've been a community organizer for 20 years and a civil rights attorney. I was an attorney with the National ACLU working in the movement to resist mass incarceration. And as a community organizer, I've really been able to span a gamut of lineages and methodologies. So I've done statewide political organizing. I've done national union organizing. I came of age in organizing with ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. And I'm so grateful to my mentors and teachers in that movement as part of queer liberation. I've always, in being an organizer and in saying, being able to say, I am an organizer for whatever that means, I think so much of the work is about locating myself in my identity and then in collective movements. So I'm queer. I come out of the Jewish tradition. I practice in the Jewish tradition. And that gives me the chance to both pass within dominant systems and to experience difference from dominant systems. So by necessity, my organizing has always been intersectional and multiracial and in a model of solidarity that none of us are free until all of us are free. And I'm so grateful for that model and to have learned it from so many who come before me. I think that's all I should say for now about that. The reason I care so much about this work is it's hard to, I cannot imagine living my life without it, because my deepest relationships are with folks who are being impacted by interlocking systems of oppression. And my own life and my own history has been impacted by interlocking systems of oppression. And given the choice between experiencing those systems and changing those systems, I can think of nothing better than being able to change those systems. And that's what we do when we come together. So that's why this work is core to who I am and a blessing every day.
My side.
Beautiful. Thank you, Liz. So it is probably clear to all of you why we've asked Liz to join in this conversation with us tonight. And in part, it's to model what we're talking about, which is the idea of organizing never being just one institution working by itself or one person working by themselves, but building relationships, broadening the circle. And so tonight we're going to do a couple of things. First, Liz is going to give us like the whirlwind 15-minute tour of organizing and what we mean when we say that word. And I think she's actually going to start with a little survey of the folks on the call just to see where folks are. After that, we're going to pause for questions, and then we're going to go into another section about some more things and some particular pointers for folks in congregations looking to go deeper into organizing work. So Liz, I'll turn it over to you to talk to the good people.
Fantastic. And if everybody saw a surprised look on my face, it's because I have homemade kombucha, which it turns out sometimes sparkles when you open it. So let that be a lesson to the world. So let's just get a sense of who's in the virtual room with us. And we're trying to do a version of raising hands. And Ashley, maybe you can help me out on how we're going to raise hands. But maybe raise your hand or type in the comments if your congregation or a group you're a part of is a formal part of what's called a CBCO organization. So that's a congregationally based community organizing organization. So that might be PICO, it might be IAF, it might be, in Minnesota, we have Isaiah. So raise your hand in some form if you're part of that. Great. Now, raise your hand if you experience your congregation as being in deep partnership with a local social justice organization that's led by and for communities being directly impacted by systems of injustice. Great. Now, raise your hand if you have ever, with your congregation, chosen a specific issue, a specific thing you wanted to change in the world on a concrete timeline, and done organizing work to win on that issue. Yay, I see hands. Well, thank you for your work. And then finally, have you ever personally, in your congregation or otherwise, been part of what you understood to be a community organizing effort? Yay, wonderful. And if your answers are no, that is wonderful too. We're really just getting a sense of how we're all entering this, and there's no wrong way to enter it. So glad you are all here. Anything to add, Ashley and Danny?
Not so far. I think just to encourage folks, if you have questions along the way, to put them in the chat box, and we will try and get to them when we get to the questions part. And I think, Liz, it is time for our whirlwind tour of organizing, and I'm going to be the one operating the slides. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and you just give me an indication when it is time to change the slides.
Great. So don't share the first one, or you can share the first one. Yeah, that's totally fine.
Yes? Okay.
Yes, go, yes. And now I have to do the funny thing where I find my notes again because it did the funny thing. Oh gosh.
Just hover over the top and hit escape to exit.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. That didn't do it. Aren't technical difficulties fun?
Always.
Hide thumbnail. No, view options. Sorry, everyone. We did practice. Oh, there it is. Fantastic. Okay. So I'm going to give a spiel. It's going to take about 15 minutes. And sorry, that's my dog. She has chosen this moment to speak to you all. I'm going to name definitions as in a declarative form. So you might hear me saying things as if it's somehow the truth of the world. There is never one truth and there is never one story. So I'm offering these definitions as provisional, as suggestions for how to understand something, not as the only and ever definition. And I'm actually going to try to close my door so that maybe my dog shows. Chloe, not right now. Not right now. Go. Thank you for bearing with me in real life, everyone. Go be quiet. Be quiet. Go. It's like having a 2-year-old, but different. So community organizing, one way to describe it is that people in local communities form vehicles for collective action based in relationships and shared self-interest to change conditions of oppression that impact them and their work towards justice. That's a lot of words. You can see it on the screen. What it really means is we come together based in where we are and who we are to shift material and concrete conditions that are impacting our lives. And what that means in practice is that's the people coming together who decide what they want to change, how they want to change it, and then act in public. And the in public part is really important to accomplish that change in the world. So it involves strategies, it involves understanding institutions and decision makers, it involves understanding and building trust with each other so that you can take those actions in effective ways. And really what that does, I mean, there's so much to say about it, but I think one of the core parts of the definition is that if we imagine we are all complicit in and part of, no matter who you are, you have some, if you live in this world, if you live in society, you are interacting with the systems around us. And there's a process of redistributing power away from systems of dominance and towards community-based collaboration. And so community organizing is always two-sided. It's the changes you are trying to make in the world towards a different world that you can imagine that more supports life, that makes people more free, that supports our families and relationships. And it's also, as it does that, having a systemic impact on who has power and who has authority. Does that make sense as a place to start? And we're on a webinar, so even if it doesn't, I'm going to keep going. There are in the last, let's say, 50 years of the United States, or 75 years of the tradition in the United States, there are forms of organizing that are generally recognized. So when people say community organizing, they might mean union organizing, which has a particular tradition. They might, and you can go, thanks, Ashley. They might mean faith organizing out of institutionally based congregations, usually in the Christian tradition. And we could talk a lot, especially in a UU context, or me coming from a Jewish context, or if our Muslim siblings were here, what it means to organize from a faith-based place in the history of the United States, not in mainstream Christianity. But there's faith organizing. There's community organizing, which is usually not existing in a formal institution, rather people coming together from the geography and circumstances of their lives. And then there's something we call movement building, which is really about large-scale social understandings of culture and change, and the long-term relationships it takes to support change over time that exists at the cultural level as much as a formal level. And sometimes movement building and cultural organizing share a shifting understanding of one another, but a lot of artists claim a tradition called cultural organizing, where change is made at the level of art and meaning and language. And of course, all these things intersect because it is never just one thing. Let's go to the next slide and talk about some really basic principles that underlie community organizing. The way you do anything is the way you do everything. How you get somewhere shapes where you get. You have to dismantle systems and practices that support oppression in your own house and in your own relationships and your own institutions if you want to build something new. There's a lot of arguments, glorious, amazing arguments within the tradition of organizing about whether you can use the tactics of dominance to change a specific thing that's impacting people's lives. And there's no right answer. I mean, this is the question of the master's tools in the master's house. If people know the quotation, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. That is a statement I believe in. It's also a thesis that plays out in complicated ways because our context shifts underneath us. A great example is when I was, I'm going to shorten this example, but when I was a lawyer, I'd often have clients who were of transgender experience, who were trying to claim rights within the legal system. And this was in 2001, and they would say, I want you to represent me just telling the judge I'm disabled, that being trans is a disability because I need this particular access to medication. Even though the narrative of a narrative that said being transgender was a disability was actually rather abhorrent, both to people of trans experience and to allies. In that moment, a particular person was trying to access something they needed, and they're like, let's just use that narrative if it gets me my medication. And that's that person's right to decide. But that's the kind of question at a large scale. I think it's harder to say that using the terms of the dominant system are ever going to get us into conditions of liberation. And that's where I think a lot of movement folks right now is saying in an individual circumstance, it's always the sovereignty and agency of an individual that matters. When we look at large scale change, we have to find new ways of getting somewhere new. We can't just reproduce relationships of dominance if we don't want to be in dominance over each other. And I think coming from a UU and a faith tradition, this is something that lives really beautifully within UUism. Second, it's in your heart and in your body and not in your ideas. Lots of us are very smart, and that is fantastic. That is part of the muscle and bone that we can use to make change. But really, our ability to feel and to know what the deeper parts of ourselves are going to get us the farthest. And this isn't about just agreeing with that statement. Again, these are ideas about what makes organizing work. But I've seen that play out again and again, that what comes from, whether you call it your heart or your gut or wherever in your body you map it, what comes from the deepest parts of us has more power in it than having the right idea. And sometimes our attachment to having the right idea can really play out relationships, especially around race and gender, that are themselves reproducing oppression inside us. Which leads me to relationships. Relationships are the foundation of organizing work. There is no strategy. There is no piece of research. There is no plan that will work if you are not in trusted relationship with others. Organizing is at its core a collective act. And so tend to those relationships first. Move at the speed of trust, to quote Adrienne Marie Brown, who wrote Emergent Strategy, which is a book I highly recommend. And move from the truth of those relationships to go into your most effective work. That is my heartfelt suggestion. And again, something I've seen play out again and again in struggles for justice. The next principle is that of self-interest, that you have to know what your stake is, literally, and I use this word specifically, what is your skin in the game? Ashley Horan has called it a non-negotiable on-ramp. So why, when it gets hard, can you tell somebody you're not just going to give up and go home if you have that option? And again, looking at racial dynamics and racial oppression as a big part of what gives whom the option of giving up and going home is a part of this, but really, no matter where you come from in your identity, knowing for yourself, your stake, why this matters. So when I say self-interest, I don't mean I don't mean selfish, and I don't mean selfless. I mean self among others, being able to name your place in the work and why you do it. Because if you're just helping, that's not bad, but it is not as powerful as saying, I do this because of the life I need to lead, because of the life I need to lead. Which leads me to power. Power is the ability to act. It is the ability to accomplish a change that you define needing to accomplish. And we build power through relationship, and we do it together. And so it's building enough power within the social matrix to be able to impact decision-making towards where you want it to go. And as congregations within the Unitarian Universalist tradition, a lot of the folks on this call can look in the history of your congregation and see how you have held power within the status quo. And this is going to be different for everybody. It is a generalization, but there is a history where congregations have held and amassed power and resources and wealth because of an alliance with being predominantly white. Not entirely right by any means, and this is not to erase the incredible tradition of Black organizing within UUism and the organizing of Native folks and folks of color in relationship with UUism, but there has been an alliance with institutional whiteness that has led to buildings and money and respect. And understanding how power works in that and the type of power we have to build and can use given that to change outcomes towards a more livable world and towards a just world and to one that engages in the repair of racial violence, that's really important and complex. And then the last point under power, we do not have enough power to be effective on our own. And this goes back to relationships. If the power I have yelling in the street is nothing like the power I have with 10,000 people beside me if I want to change outcomes. The next principle is that of solidarity. And this is where if we were in person, I would just ask, what do you think solidarity is? But the way I'll posit it here is that I might fight and dream and imagine from a particular understanding of myself and who I am, but we also show up for one another, for people very different from how we understand ourselves because we are interconnected and independent, interconnected and interdependent. What happens to Ashley at every level impacts the life I lead. What happens to Danny at every level impacts the life I lead. Danny and I have not existed in the same circumstances, but when we show up for each other, out of the truth of our interconnection, what becomes possible is, it's glorious. Solidarity also means that we all experience violence and oppression. We all experience privilege and possibility. And we all experience, each of us, we are all experiencing privilege. We are all experiencing oppression in different ways. And we all experience identities that we can and can't see on each other's skin. And we all have complexity. We are different bodies and different people in different communities. And within that, different bodies, and especially racialized bodies, especially bodies understood to be indigenous to this land, are targeted very differently than bodies perceived to be white. When you're standing in front of a cop, your skin matters. And so we have to hold the complexity of our multiple identities and experiences with a facticity, with a materiality of how things work in the world in moments of conflict. And we have to be responsible to that, especially if you're coming from skin that looks like mine. We have to be responsible to that. And then finally, solidarity is about collective action and shared liberation. We're going to get where we're going together by acknowledging how we experience experience different things and the connections that run through us within those differences. It also means, final point on solidarity, that we, especially as congregations, have often the opportunity to leverage our identities and appearances, especially if they align with an imagination from the dominant system. We have the opportunity to leverage our identities and appearances in service of a long-term strategic goal. So congregations might be safe playing a role that frontline communities can't. I am safe doing things that are, I would not ever make this claim for Danny, but I am willing to say I am safe doing things that would not be as safe for Danny. And so sometimes it is a strategic choice that we play those different roles in relationship with one another to accomplish a goal. So Ashley might dress up in a twin set and trousers and go up to mall security and talk to them while protesters come in the back. And that's, I love that example, but it's also, how can you be doing that as congregations if you have respect in your community, if you have relationships with the decision makers, if you're seen as a moral force? How can you use that position in a strategic way to leverage change? And that's part of solidarity. And it builds on relationships, power, self-interest. Each of these principles builds to what's possible among us. Final slide, slides. What do you need to know? And these are my last words before we wrap up this section. Don't do anything by yourself. Start with relationship and move from there. If you don't have the relationship, go back to square one until you do, and then you can move to square two. It's the definition of don't pass go. Build the relationship and work from there. You can make mass change when you start at a small scale. This is not haphazard. There are skills and practices and tools and methodologies that you can learn, and this hour will not be enough, but hopefully it'll give you a taste and an entrance point towards training yourself. And finally, and this is not on the slide, and I know I'm saying something slightly different as the slides cycle through. This is where it's just polyvocal, which is real to the work. So this is the thing that's not on the slide. Know your history. We exist in a history. We all do. We all exist in a before and after. And I think sometimes it is tempting to come to organizing as if nobody has ever thought about this before. And that's not, I think as individuals, as congregations, we all know and practice humility. And so it's a reminder to practice that when you come into organizing. Really know the people who have come before you and where you are sitting in that landscape. And that's not to paralyze you. You should still act even if you don't know everything. But notice when you come into a new space, do I know who is here before? And if you don't, spend some time finding out even as you act. It's sort of, you shouldn't, I can't act until I know everything. That's not good. You should act. But it's what does it mean to act responsibly? It's inquiring into what has come before as you start to act, and that will serve your relationships. Ashley and Danny, that was a little bit of a like a long inhale, all exhale spiel about organizing and about the time we said it would take. I know we were going to go to questions, but obviously if there's anything at all to add. And thank you for putting up with my dog. Oh my goodness. She just, ugh.
Everybody loves Chloe. None of us can
Well,
do it.
yes, people have posted, what is the dog's name and can we see it? So
Yes. Her name is Chloe. She's a rescue pup. I have no idea what breed. She's about 6 years old.
So great. We need to include all beings in.
She's running downstairs. She thinks there's a mouse.
Well,
okay.
Real. Folks, I want you to know
Chloe.
that we're going to share the
she's not gonna
link.
do it.
Oh, Chloe's not coming. She's on strike now.
Yeah. If she shows up, I'll move the camera.
We're going to make the slides available to you. I will actually put the link to the slides in our chat here in a second. I will also share with you a link to a glossary of terms that we have compiled. It's an informal and incomplete glossary, but a lot of the terms that we're throwing around tonight are ones that are really common in kind of organizing spaces, but not necessarily common in congregational life. And so we're going to share both the slides from this presentation and this glossary for you so that you have them as reference. And then we will also add them to the attachment for the recording of this video so that folks can access them. So in the chat here, this first link is the is the glossary of terms, and then I will add the link to the PowerPoint as well. So let's pause for some questions. I think we can do maybe 10 minutes of questions, depending on what folks have to offer, and we will then move on to the next portion.
And so let me remind you that the way you unmute is to either hover over your picture, and if the unmute doesn't show up, you can do that. And your phone, I think, is picking it back up. I'm not sure. And or you can also type your questions in the chat.
Beautiful. So Lisa, did we have any?
There were just clarifications about what was the name of the book that Liz recommended, your post about the Kaleo Center, and Chloe's name.
Chloe's name, important.
So far.
Beautiful. While folks are thinking of questions, I'm going to now put the link to the glossary in the chat. That first one was the slideshow.
So Liz, she's gone.
There's Liz.
There
She's
you
coming
are.
back
Hi,
in.
Liz. So I'm at a congregation just a year and a half in, so relatively new there, and in a different community than where I'm from, and where I've been connected with community organizing. So I'm curious about that first step around relationships, and if you want to just spend a minute or two with some words of wisdom around how to, even find partners, how to begin to establish relationships. I don't know about other folks, but we're at a small church, so I'm always mindful of making sure that if we're going to begin a relationship, that we're going to stay in it.
Who from the team would like to field that?
I think it was specifically to you, but I think all three of us probably have something to add.
Yes, Ashley, Danny, please.
Go for it, Liz.
Okay, sorry. That is a question for which I don't have an answer. This is sort of at the limit of, I'll rewind that sentence. There are so many times I do these trainings and we come to the point where people are like, okay, so how do we do this? And it is both, I know, frustrating that often and on again and again I say, you do it from an intuitive place of building the thing and then acting and then building then acting. I think it is a balance point that happens in context that there isn't a set of criteria for, right? Because you're right, you actually shouldn't just show up and leave. But if you can't act without the perfect opportunity, you are not in the struggle of solidarity. I think this is best workshopped through examples. So I'd actually say if you have an example of something you're thinking of, that's more useful to speak to, because I don't think there is a way to answer it in theory, because it's all about kind of the principles we're talking about restated. Or maybe Ashley or Danny, if you have an example from your organizing experience that illuminates when it's gone right or gone wrong, and I could certainly pull up an example as well.
I think Dave.
I'm having some internet trouble a little bit, so if I could you have Laura please repeat the question again?
Sure, Danny. I was talking about, being new at a congregation and new in a community of a small congregation, and this idea of being in relationship. We've had a couple organizations that we've partnered with, but it's mostly, I would say, around social service, where we'll drop off Meals on Wheels or collect things for a home where people have experienced abuse are living. Make backpacks for kids in the school districts, for instance. But none of them are partnerships where we have created relationships with people impacted by injustice. So my question is, how about that first step about creating those types of relationships and really being mindful about not just running out and making new friends when there's not necessarily the capacity to maintain strong relationships.
Yeah. I agree with Liz that there's not like a criteria or kind of a, here's where you go and make sure you have these checkpoints in place in order to establish it. But I think it's about really leaning into this space of not knowing with a heart of compassion, in a way of being open to the possibility of mistakes being made, not allowing, because what I think I sense coming from folks, especially white folks in this kind of work, is the fragility comes into play, and that's when it gets prickly, and it's hard to understand like what to gauge or measure what might be the success of the relationship when it gets prickly, as much as it is about staying at the table when you are in relationships with impacted communities. And so I guess, and what I would add to it would be more so around, there's this kind of trend that's happening where we're seeing, liberals that are running towards impacted communities with this desire to be in relationship with them around the crises that's at hand. So, for example, when Black Lives Matter was really kind of the thing that was happening, you had a lot of different communities that were coming, based upon the trend of the crises that was happening. And prior to the crises, there was no relationship. And so thinking about what particular impacted communities and or groups of folks, of course, crises are real and always kind of present, but being in relationship outside of the crises, in that sense. And that would be some of the advice I would have. Hopefully you could hear that well over my phone.
I think something I'd pull out in that, Jenny, I was just realizing as you were talking, a thread in that for me is know why, interrogate why you are starting the relationship, and bring that clarity of intent into your actions. And if you don't have the capacity to sustain the relationship, what would you need to have the capacity to sustain the relationship? Because it's also about saying, here's what we can commit, and being honest about what that commitment is, and then following through on that commitment. And even if that's at a small scale, if you bring clarity of intent and purpose with self-interest, with an honest assessment, with what capacity would we need to grow so that we can be useful, and then pushing against what we might be taught to get it perfect or right before acting, which is, I'm only restating the wisdom that Danny offered. So,
and I want to add to that, Liz talked a little bit about the concept of movement building, which is this long-term intersectional, sort of developing of our capacity and our relationships over time in service of our shared struggles of collective liberation. And what I would say about that is that often there is a catalyst moment. There's a moment when something happens, and that's sort of what Danny was referring to with this sort of swath of killings of Black men in particular by the police. That was a catalyst to the springboard of the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, of course, we all know that had been happening and continues to happen, but in that particular moment, there was media attention paid, people started paying attention in public, having conversations. But the movement for Black lives, as with most mass movements, would not have taken off had people not been doing relationship building for a very long time before that. And so when we ask about, how are we building partnerships, part of it is literally just getting to know people, knowing who's in your community, like who are the folks who are showing up at their city council and asking questions, who are the people who are, concerned about neighborhood politics, who's moving in and who's moving out, what kind of struggles are employees and low-wage workers having in your area, who's coming together at PTA meetings, and this sort of very small scale stuff. So when people ask the question about how do we begin to develop relationships, sometimes it's literally going to the PTA meeting or the city council meeting or the neighborhood festivals and figuring out who the players are. What are the local organizations and the local actors? You start get to know people. And I would also add that social media is an incredibly powerful tool for organizing. And it is nearly impossible to really be keeping up with sort of who's organizing where and what relationships are at play if you don't have a line on social media. So Facebook, Twitter, Instagram are sort of the big three right now around how people are publicizing their work. And so whether or not you yourself are a user of those things, if you're in a congregation that's looking to develop those kind of relationships, it's really important to have somebody on your team who's monitoring like what the local organizations are doing, when the rallies are being held, or when the local organizing meeting is happening, and sending representatives to those. And in the concept of building, right? So at some point, something's going to explode and people are going to need to run out a door, right? And hopefully people will be running in the same direction. And what movement building is about is trying to keep those doors open enough and have people know and trust each other enough so that when the thing happens, everybody's ready to move. And that happens in 1,000 ways. And sometimes the initial work of that relationship building is super unsexy. I'm thinking of the example of like, when we had the murder of Jamar Clark here in Minneapolis by the Minneapolis police, and there was an 18-day occupation of the 4th precinct in Minneapolis, one of the first things that happened was, people are staying overnight in tents in the cold. There were no bathrooms. And so very quickly, one of the things that the organizers asked was, hey, we need people to fundraise and get some porta potties here. And it was a really unsexy role to be played. It was literally dealing with human waste. But the fact that folks were able to come together and make that happen really quickly was a huge trust builder, because then the organizers knew that, okay, these people are going to show up. Now we can ask for more. And it begins sometimes in those very small ways and over time develops.
This is Lisa, if I can just add here, another example of how this happened is the way so many UU ministers were involved in Selma, now more than 50 years ago, was based on the relationships that they had developed before Selma with people in the movement then. And if you go to look at the Commemoration of Selma event website, you'll see Mark Morrison Reed talking about how relationship really is the key to all of this kind of organizing back then and now. But we didn't have social media back then.
Beautiful. So we have about half an hour left, and I think we want to move into this last section, and then if we've got a couple of minutes left, we'll take some more questions at the end. But yeah, I think but Danny, actually, I saw you wanted to add something to that before Lisa jumped in. Do you want to share?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that in that work and beginning to establish relationships, I agree with everything that you said, Ashley, with reaching out to folks in that way, is coming to the table without an agenda of your own, is because so say for instance, we went to the PTA meeting and, you got in contact with some of the marginalized, or impacted communities or whatever. And they're like, yeah, we're open to kind of meeting and rallying. It's like, okay, well, I got this great idea. And it's rather than it's about saying, so what is it that, how can I best serve you in addressing your concerns and or issues, and offering feedback when, respectfully asked, not interjecting like, there's a better way to do it. Though it's well intended and I know it's great and we have experience and success in doing things the way that we do, but in working with communities that are impacted, it's very important that our agendas are set aside and that we're standing in solidarity with their values.
That is, every example I can think of, because there's some relationship to don't come in and assume you have the best idea. Come in and do the work, right? When I teach direct organizing trainings, which I'm lucky enough to do often, it really boils down to 3 things. Pause, breathe, count to 3, then act. That's rule number 1. Pause, breathe, count to 3. 2, don't freak out. Or if you are freaking out, pause, breathe, and act. And 3, don't have an idea. In a direct action, unless it is really explicitly your job to be leading, don't have an idea, which is just a way of kind of like burrowing into our brains what Danny is so gorgeously describing, which it is not your role to have the best idea. It is your role to be useful to work that's being defined by the folks who are most impacted by the systems we are trying to change. And and that's where it gets into the complexity of identity and what we wear on our skins, right? And I think we're going to come to a point, hi, Aspendell, where we talk more about what we mean by frontline communities and why it's so important that we build leadership around frontline communities. Does that make sense to what you're saying, Danny? Awesome.
Yes,
Yeah, it really does. And now my 3-year-old is saying hello to everybody. She saw Liz and she loves Liz and said hello.
Just say hello.
Oh no.
Oh, no.
Okay. Sorry. So many creatures in our lives. So Liz, I actually think that's a really wonderful segue into some of the pieces that we're going to talk about now. So this question you mentioned of strategy, like it's not your idea, it's not your job to have an idea. Can you talk to us about strategy?
My favorite thing is to like look at people, especially folks who experience the world as white, and just really say, are you having an idea right now? And have worked with them in trainings enough that they're like, nope, I was not having an idea. So we're going to go over areas of concrete steps, and we're each going to take one. So I'll outline those areas, and then I'll go into one of them. The first area is strategy. The second area is about leadership, which Danny will talk about. The third area is about mapping the landscape in your community, which Ashley will talk about. And the fourth area is we'll come back again to a little bit more content around relationships, which I will talk us through. So starting with strategy, and again, if we were in a room together, I'd ask, what do you think strategy is? And we'd group source some understanding of that. I'm going to assume we actually have a working felt definition of strategy, and it's especially in the glossary that Ashley is saying. So I'm going to say things about concrete steps around strategy. And the first is what we've been saying in different ways and what Danny really pointed out, which is that it is not, as a congregation showing up to work with frontline communities, it is not your role to invent strategies for others. Rather, it's your role to be part of a long-term strategy through relationship. You may need to internally organize, you may need a strategy that you actually have, heart, head, guts, to organize your congregation to be ready to act in solidarity with somebody else's strategy. But really, this keeps coming back to, we believe that systemic and mass change is the most effective, the most meaningful, and the most just when it is led by the people who are most directly impacted on their bodies by systems of oppression. And so as a congregation that is, if you are predominantly white, even if you are not entirely white, and that's understanding and honoring the experience of folks of color and Native and Indigenous folks within congregations. But if you are a predominantly white congregation or a congregation that's benefited from institutional whiteness, coming to frontline work, not really practicing foundational humility, that you are there to be in service of a vision in a concrete way and not to have the best ideas about the vision. Which leads me to a different part of strategy that I call the Lake Street Bridge lecture. And here in Minneapolis, we have an amazing group of people who for 30 years have been standing out on the Lake Street Bridge every week with signs that say peace. And if you are somebody on this call who is part of that community, please know that, like, I honor your contributions, and how dare I come here and be snarky about it when I'm not the one standing on the bridge. But the piece about strategy is that I do not believe that standing on a bridge with peace signs is going to change government policy. I do not believe 20 people standing on a bridge with peace signs is going to change government policy. It might change the energetics of the world. It might influence cars going past. But I do not believe that standing on a bridge with peace signs is a strategy to change government policy. So the question really is, are you matching what you're doing? Like, if you are in a role of being a strategic thinker, and I know that's in tension with what I just said of don't make strategy, but if you are engaging with strategy, is what you're doing somehow connected to the concrete goal that you've named on a timeline in the world. Not just because you think it should be, but because you have some evidence or steps of thinking or a tested model, or even just a linked set of here's how we believe people act in the world that we've seen in practice that supports the idea that how you are acting will lead to that goal. Does that make sense as a bit about strategy? Awesome. So on to leadership from Danny.
Danny, you're still muted.
So leadership, I'm sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties, so I'm bouncing back and forth. But leadership, talking about being leaders out in the world is in organizing. So there's really two facets of organizing in this context or framework. And one is internal organizing, and then the other is solidarity with external organizing. Internal organizing really speaks to this notion of like, what does organizing your congregation look like? I just was down in First Unitarian Universalist of Rochester, that beautiful congregation and building that was built in 1866 and now relocated, and doing work with them. And there were folks that during a forum that I shared afterwards there were some folks that were talking about, divestment of government funds or state funds or public funds towards the military. There was another person who was talking about, I really feel passionate about building a healthy relationship with the new chief of police down here, and because we just now hired our first Somali officer. And then there's another person that was there, a group of persons there was like, yo, I really want to do some work with local organizers who are striving to center the narrative of the Somali community that's being impacted by, under resources and so forth and so on. And so that's kind of a nice, colorful array of issues. And so coming to the table around intersectionality in this, how do we begin to see, like, what does the issues that move the individual folks, how does that align with our congregational values, principles, ways in which that we said that we show up our end statements, the things, the direction of our, maybe anti-racism leadership teams or whatever, our racial justice teams. So that can be kind of complex. I'll quickly jump into solidarity with external organizing. And this is how we show up for movements led directly by impacted communities. And it's piggybacking a little bit off of what I was talking about earlier with the question from Reverend Laura about relationships. That solidarity, I'll give you a quick story. When Black Lives Matter Minneapolis did the action, the first action at the Mall of America, where we prayed and sang Christmas carols, some of it got some pretty nice attention. I had saw at that particular time, there was a person that I had saw just come and was like close in proximity to me, never said who they were. It was a white person, actually. I never knew this person's name or whatever, but I kept seeing this person after that at almost every action. And it was just their consistency, and not that you have to come to every action to show real solidarity, but their consistency in the way in which that they were striving to be present for us really drew me into a space of where I wanted to know more about this person and developed a great friendship. But this person didn't show up with like an agenda of I'm coming to try to do A, B, C. This person wasn't trying to be seen or get recognition. This person just really was using their being in the fullness of their capacity to stand in solidarity. And I've seen things work in that way as well. So I don't want to take up too much time. I want to give us an opportunity to jump into mapping the landscape of our community with Ashley.
Yeah, I love that, Danny. It's sort of this rule of the people who you organize are the ones who are already in your congregation, and the people who you follow are already leading outside of your congregation. So the job is to get the people in your congregation to show up with others who are already leading outside. I love that. So we already talked a little bit about how you even figure out who the people in your community are who are doing the leading and who to follow. And I think this is a great moment to talk just about sort of the uncertainty that comes with that kind of quest, right? If we want to be in deep relationship, Danny already mentioned this, like there's messiness. Liz mentioned it too. A couple of things that I've seen pop up again and again. The first is sort of this fear, like sometimes Unitarian Universalists lead because we fear what would happen if we tried to follow and we were told that we weren't necessary or they didn't need us. And I think that's real for many of us, is this sort of like, we'd rather be in charge than be told that we're not absolutely necessary. And so I think some really good centering questions around that are like, what do we have to offer? Knowing ourselves internally, what do we have to offer in terms of our human resources, our infrastructure, our financial resources? Do we have we're going to talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but what kind of assets do we have that we could share that, maybe you don't need me to be on the front lines of a protest, but you do need us to raise the money for the porta potty, for the action, or whatever it is. And slowly, as Danny said, it's that showing up again and again that builds those relationships. And I think just to acknowledge that, we are up against a system that wants us to feel like everybody is a stranger, everybody who doesn't look like us, everybody who lives in a different neighborhood, that we're divided, right? And so often I hear Unitarian Universalists talking about loving being in community in our congregations with like-minded people. And I think there's a lot of beauty in that. But I also want to push us in our organizing to think about getting over the fear of what it would be like to be in solidarity with people who aren't like-minded on all of the things, right? What would it take to organize around racial justice with the conservative Pentecostal Latinx congregation around town about immigration? Maybe you don't have the same theology. Maybe you don't have even similar values around who belongs in your congregation, but you do share common interests around immigration, for example. And so what does it look like to build relationship over time, even when we are not exactly alike? So speaking of relationships, Liz, do you want to say some more? You're muted.
Ta-da! All right, some quick points for concrete steps for working towards relationships, because we keep saying it, but really like a little bit of how do you do it. I wrote down for myself to say to you, reach out and start building relationships, which is not disingenuous. It really is. You do it by doing it. And sometimes by doing it wrong, and that's okay. We live in it's okay if you are responsible to the consequences. If you cause harm, we know we all need to repair harm that we cause, but you do it by doing it. Second, show up with an ask and an offer. So don't show up. It's really a way of saying, it's really hard when in moments, especially of pressure, people show up and say, tell us what to do, or what should we do? And yet I am saying, follow the lead of others, right? So you're like, tell us what to do. But sometimes what's needed is for you to figure out what to do without taking over the strategy. And really, there is no better example than the porta potty. Look around, see what's needed within the context of a strategy that's already set, and figure out for yourself, how could we provide that? And then you show up saying, it seems like you might need porta potties. We have figured out how to get you one. Would that be helpful? And then you're ready to do it. So it's being material and concrete.
Can I add one thing to that, Liz?
Yes.
My tip on this would be like, when you're showing up to say, how can we be of use? Show up and ask a multiple choice question rather than asking for an essay answer. So, right, here are some things that we could offer. Are any of these helpful to you? Versus tell us what to do.
It's a lot like the advice you get for working with somebody in a personal crisis. You don't say, what do you need? You say, do you need me to do a load of laundry? Can I bring you dinner? You give options, because it's you don't want people, we're all getting it. I will move on. Don't assume that your job is to have the better answer or offer your stupendous insight. Get dirty and do the work. And then I have a bunch of other stuff, but really what I want to cut. The most effective practice I have ever found of building relationships of trust in organizing and movement building is called one-to-ones. And that is sitting down one-to-one with another person to find out more about their story and why they are drawn to justice work. It is a conversation without an agenda from which you can build meaningful and personal invitations into the work. So you learn each other's self-interest. You learn how you could imagine connecting to what somebody cares about because you have learned what they care about. And you invest in the skills of that other person and make a plan to build trust and relationships in the landscape with each other. So it is, those are a lot of things that mean an intentional, purposeful conversation where your agenda is to listen deeply and learn what matters to that other person and what matters to them in justice work so that you can build meaningful invitations off of that knowing of each other. Relationship is knowing each other. And that means we have to sit down in person on purpose and know each other without trying to fix somebody or get them, or without getting, like, if I sit down and say, Ashley, I want to sit down with you so I can get you to do this thing, I might get her to do the thing, but it's not the same as, Ashley, I really want to know who you are, and let's start there and see if we share interests coming out of that knowing.
Beautiful. So we've talked a little bit about mapping our own assets so that we know what we can offer when we're making those asks and offers. But Danny, I know you've got a couple of really concrete examples of this. Do you want to talk about what you've seen congregations show up and offer?
Yeah, so during the, we talked about earlier, Ashley referenced the murder of Jamar Clark in Minneapolis by the police and an 18-day of occupation that ensued. And so during that time, I mean, this occupation wasn't something that we for sure didn't plan for and had to build while we were on the ground. And so we were looking for a space or place to hold a training for some of the work that we will be doing coming up. And there's a church in Minneapolis on the north side called Community Covenant Church, whose pastor had just, I'm not even sure how, in fact, they even got out there. I mean, of course, it was on the news and things like that, but they showed up on the front line. And as a clergy liaison for Black Lives Matter, it was my role to organize faith communities and those that, you know, came to show support for us. And so when we were looking for a space to host this training, they were like, yo, you can come to our church. You can host a training here. And this is a training that involved both some kind of intellectual stuff, but also involved some hands-on, you know, physical training. So it was a total taking over of this space on, you know, that wasn't planned. It didn't get approved by the board or the deacons or whoever it is that you have to, you know, go through those channels. The pastor or persons in charge just was like, yo, this is important. We need this right now. Let's do that. And it proved to be the seedling for ongoing relationship with this particular congregation. I've seen it show up in ways during the occupation of the governor's mansion here in Minnesota after the killing of Philando Castile, an unarmed man who was killed by the Falcon Heights Police Department. The Unity Church Unitarian, which is a church that I'm partnered with, opened up their church as a space for activists and organizers, not only to come and have meetings, but to come and store our food, to come and host retreats. It was open 24 hours a day for folks to just come and whether sleep, however we needed the building, we were able to access it. And so those are a couple examples of how I've seen congregations.
Yeah, and I think there's a broad array of very concrete resources that our congregations can offer. Most of our congregations are 501c3 organizations, and offering fiscal sponsorship to emerging coalitions and organizations is one way. If you've got a church van, you could be driving striking workers. If you've got a copier, you could be donating copies. You know, if you've got an industrial kitchen, maybe you let folks come in before a meeting, or maybe you've got folks who are really excited about serving sandwiches at a homeless shelter. What if they took those cooking skills and provided free meals for organizers before their meetings? That's a thing I know Laura Smidzik and I were both involved in here in the Twin Cities, just like literally making a meal and dropping it off for the Black Lives Matter organizers so that they didn't have to worry about those logistics as they were planning. Those are the kinds of things that often are real builders of relationship, just offering what we have. And I think that really leads into this last point that we want to make before we take a couple of questions at the end here, which is just about solidarity. And I want to flag that our next webinar is really about building partnerships and relationships of solidarity. So we're going to go even deeper into this. But, you know, I think we want to offer that a basic principle in all of this is that we're most effective in the world at creating a more just society when the leadership is by folks who are the most impacted. Poor people know more about poverty than rich people do. Folks of color and indigenous people know more about colonialism and racism than white folks do. Women and gender nonconforming folks know more about patriarchy and misogyny than men do. And, you know, so I think always asking, are we in partnership with people who are leading from their own experience? And for us, actually, as Unitarian Universalists, this is a deeply theological stance. We understand direct experience to be sacred text. Unlike religions that require an interpretation by a clergy person or a sacred scripture, we understand that the direct experience of our lives is revelation. And so with that understanding, of course, it's the folks who have experienced injustice who have the solutions for how to get out of it. And I think on that, I know both Danny and Liz and I, we could all probably say a lot more, but we've got only 5 minutes left. So I want to see if there are any questions that we might be able to address in this last minute or two. And if you want to flag us with a question, either by putting it in the chat box or just waving your hand at us.
I see Dell is moving to try to unmute. Dell or Dell's.
This is Trish.
Step over in front of the thing.
Oh, hi. Am I huge? Yes. Okay.
Hi, Trish.
Hi. Yes. And I have so many questions that I want to ask. I have to sort of do a little pick and choose right now. So I'm going to pick the one that's most top on my mind because it just happened. Literally, while we were doing this, I got an email because back up. We are members of an organization called CLOUT, Citizens of Louisville Organized and United Together. And it is a group of 20-some different churches, and we work together, organizing to accomplish very specific tasks. And every year they have their big assembly where they get all the people together, and we confront the public officials, trying to get them to agree to do what we've, through our research and conversations and work with all of our communities, have determined is one specific thing that can improve the community in Louisville. And so I just discovered that the board is meeting on the same night as this group is having their assembly.
Church board.
Our church board. And so I sent them a message. Could you reschedule? Because I really would love to see that our church leadership is there supporting our membership with all the membership of all of these other churches. And so I'm sitting there going, and they said, well, we can't move the meeting, but I'll certainly let people who want to go know that they're allowed to go. So do you see what I'm saying? It's sort of like I'm going asking for the leadership of my church to move a meeting so that they can support all of our members in this. You know, this is the annual meeting where they do the big collective meeting with the public officials. And so I guess it's sort of like, how do I build partnership with the leadership of our church that doesn't seem to have the same.
They're not woke.
Yeah, I guess, yeah. Dell says they're not woke.
So
okay.
I have a real quick response to that, which is, first of all, what we all need is a deep bench, and we need people, many people with many skills doing a lot of things at all times. So an immediate suggestion that comes to mind is, what if 1 or 2 board members, enough so that you still had your quota at the board meeting for a quorum, what if 1 or 2 board members, their board duty that night was to go to that meeting? Or in a longer term way, what if you sat down and had a one-to-one with your board? You know, what if the social justice team sat down and tried to talk to the board and figure out, where are your shared alignments? You know, what are the goals that both of these teams have? It may not be this meeting that is the one that they can go to, but I think that concept of doing one-to-ones can happen within your congregation, right? So, I mean, what would happen if you sat down with your board president, or you got folks together for a visioning meeting together about shared social justice priorities? And I know actually there's somebody else on the call who wanted to hear a little bit more about one-to-one. So Liz, I'm seeing you nodding, and I know Danny, you probably have some stuff to add to this too. Thoughts, friends?
I would let Danny jump in first if he has thoughts. Awesome. So when I was listening to your question, my first question was, have you had a one-to-one with the folks? Because, I mean, Ashley said it, it's not, and for this particular, the process of change and relationship is long. Every time you're not where you want to be, that's just information that you haven't gotten there. And I think Ashley is so wise to say, how can you both take this opportunity and honor board commitments? But for me, I'm like, I'm trying to say like less, but really I don't want to, and I also don't want to, one-to-one sometimes get held up as the be-all and end-all, and what it really means is ongoing conversations to discover the values you share in an honest way are the be-all and end-all. So have you had a serious and intentional series of conversations with the folks in leadership where you are so profoundly curious about their values and what they care about, and that you're able to enter that conversation at first without judgment? If you are entering thinking they don't get it, they are not going to feel the conditions to share their deepest hopes and dreams with you. And if they cannot share their deepest hopes and dreams with you, then you cannot figure out whether you share values enough to invite each other into shared work. And the beautiful thing about this is some people will not share your values in ways that allow for shared work, and that is okay. It means you need to maneuver around each other, and that's fine. It means you split the board meeting or find other ways, or don't depend on this particular alignment of leadership to carry the work, or change the leadership. But you're not there unless and until, and maybe you have and maybe you haven't because I'm not in this with you, but I know you're not there unless and until you have, with boundless curiosity and reserved judgment, said, have I been trusted with understanding this person's hopes and dreams? And do we have a place of shared work? And then it's problem solving, which isn't easy, but it's a different question. Because if you do have shared values and you can find a place of intersection, then it's just how do we meet all our different needs and opinions and ideas, and how can we be in productive and loving conflict with each other sometimes? But it's very different than actually not knowing.
And I guess the only thing I would add to this is there's a reading that I normally do at a lot of the trainings that I do for MUUSJA around organizing that comes from the Talmud on the Old Testament text found in the Bible of Micah 6:8, and it says this. It says, "Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief." And then it calls us to say, to do justice now, love mercy now, walk humbly now. You're not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. And so it's that kind of thing with dealing with boards and, church bodies and things of understanding that, there may be those who may not be able to subscribe to your narrative, but you still have this thing in you that's calling you to do justly now, to love mercy now, to walk humbly now. You may not be able to complete it, but you can't abandon it just because the board or some other institution is not willing to ride with you. So that's what I would add.
Okay.
That's lovely. I notice we are at time. Liz, Ashley, Danny, is there some closing words you want before I close with our reading for this evening?
I think my last encouragement is just that this is ongoing, iterative work. It repeats often in cycles. Sometimes you feel like you're starting over, and it is built over time. And so, we take little victories when they come, we celebrate, we have joy about them. And also, as Danny said, it's not our responsibility to complete the work, nor can we abandon it. And so if we understand ourselves as part of a long legacy, a long lineage of people who are working to bend the arc of the universe toward justice, it just becomes our practice of being human together. So blessings on all of you as you do that in your congregations, and thank you for being with us tonight.
Blessings. Thank you.
Much gratitude for inviting me into this conversation. My closing metaphor, it's what I come back to again and again for myself, is of holding an egg. You don't squeeze too tightly that you break it, but you don't squeeze so lightly that you drop it. And that is a building of our intuition through practice.
Well, on behalf of the MidAmerica region, I just really want to thank you, Pastor Danny, Reverend Ashley, and Organizer Liz, for all your wisdom tonight. And it's, at the beginning, I just jumped and got one of my favorite books of readings, which is Voices from the Margin, our meditation manual for written by persons of color. And this is one I often end trainings with, and I can't imagine that I could have chosen anything better. It's by Joseph Cherry. It's called Prayer for Living Intention. If we have any hope of transforming the world and changing ourselves, we must be bold enough to step into our discomfort, brave enough to be clumsy there, loving enough to forgive ourselves and others. May we as a people of faith be granted the strength to be so bold, so brave, and so loving. And so thank you for the work that you do in trying to bend that arc toward justice a little bit closer. And thank you for your support of all that needs to be done in this world. Thank you, and good night.